The room was cold. A biting, sterile chill clung to the air, as if even the walls themselves recoiled from the cruelty that was about to unfold. It was the kind of cold that seeped into bones, chilling not just the skin but the soul. The metallic clank of the heavy doors echoed through the dim chamber as they swung shut behind the guards, their footsteps dull and methodical against the stone floor that I in the center of the room. A small figure sat. A child, no older than 12, huddled in a chair far too large for his frail body. His wrists, bound by leather straps, were dwarfed by the metal arms of the electric chair. His face was pale, too pale, the color of someone who had seen too much fear, too much pain, for far too long. His eyes, large, hollow pools of darkness, stared blankly ahead, as if they had given up on pleading with the world that had forsaken him. No one moved to meet his gaze. The guards stood rigidly at attention, their faces set in stone, their eyes trained on anything but the child in front of them. It was easier that way, they had learned. Easier to detach from what was happening, easier to pretend this was all just another routine part of the job. But this wasn't routine, not even close. Behind the thick, iron bars of a viewing window, the boy's mother collapsed to the ground, her wails echoing in the sterile chamber. Her hands clawed at the glass, tears streaming down her face, mingling with her frantic sobs. "He's just a child," she screamed, her voice breaking, shattering the heavy silence of the room. "He didn't do it. You can't do this. Not to him. Please, not to my baby." Her pleas fell on deaf ears. The judge, sitting at his high bench, read the sentence in a voice that carried a weight of finality. His words were detached, clinical, as if the life he was condemning wasn't human, as if the child before him was simply a name on a piece of paper. Guilty of first-degree murder, the judge declared, his tone cold and indifferent. The sentence is death by electrocution. The court had decided. The system had decided. A system built on laws written by men in positions of power, upheld by those too weary or too indifferent to question them. And here, in this cold chamber, that system was about to snuff out a young life with the flick of a switch. The boy's name was Isaac. He was barely old enough to understand the magnitude of what was happening to him. His small hands, trembling in the leather restraints, gripped the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in shallow, shaky gasps, the weight of the world pressing down on his narrow chest. He had never been in a courtroom before that fateful day. He hadn't even been in the same room as the person they said he killed. The wealthy, powerful businessman whose influence spread like a dark cloud over the town. But none of that mattered. They needed someone to pay for the crime, and Isaac, poor and defenseless, had been the perfect scapegoat. The trial had been a farce. Everyone in the courtroom had known it, even if they refused to admit it out loud. The defense attorney, appointed by the court and clearly disinterested, had barely bothered to argue the case. Witnesses had been coerced, evidence twisted beyond recognition. And the jury? The jury hadn't even looked at Isaac when the verdict was read. Guilty. The word had echoed in the small room like a death knell, sealing his fate. No one had fought for him. Not the lawyers, not the system, not even the town that had once known him as the quiet, kind-hearted boy who played by the river. They had all turned their backs, too frightened or too apathetic to stand up against the powerful forces that controlled everything. That Isaac's only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But that hadn't mattered. Justice wasn't blind here. It was guided by hands that twisted it to suit their own ends. Now, as the final moments of his life ticked away, Isaac's small body trembled with fear. His heart raced, pounding against his ribcage like a trapped bird desperate to escape. He had asked once, just once, if anyone would believe him, if anyone would help, but his words had been met with silence. The kind that crushed hope until it was nothing more than a faint whisper in the wind that a figure in a gray suit approached the switch, his hand hovering above it for what felt like an eternity. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with the weight of impending death. Time slowed, stretched, as if the universe itself was unwilling to let this atrocity unfold. Isaac's eyes fluttered closed. He was so tired, tired of fighting, tired of pleading, tired of hoping that someone, anyone, would save him. His small body sagged in the chair, as if already surrendering to the fate that awaited him. And then, just as the man's hand moved to flick the switch, Isaac's lips parted and a single word escaped his mouth. "Mama!" The sound was barely more than a whisper, but it echoed in the silence like a thunderclap. His mother, beyond the glass, wailed, her voice cracking with a pain so raw it seemed to shake the very walls of the chamber. But it was too late. The man's hand descended, and the room was filled with the deafening roar of electricity. Bright, searing light filled the space as Isaac's small body convulsed violently in the chair. The smell of burning flesh permeated the air, acrid and foul, and the room seemed to shrink around the horror of what was happening. His tiny frame, so fragile, so young, was ravaged by the surge of power that coursed through him. The lights flickered. The switch was pulled again. And just like that, the room went dark. The silence that followed was unbearable. It was the kind of silence that wasn't really silence at all, filled with the echoes of screams, the hum of the electricity, the weight of what had just happened. No one spoke. No one moved. The guards stood stiffly, their faces pale, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground. The boy, the child who had barely lived long enough to know what life was, lay still in the chair, his body limp, his head tilted to one side. His eyes, once filled with fear, now stared blankly ahead, unseeing. The straps around his wrists and ankles seemed almost comically large now, binding a body that no longer had the strength to resist. Isaac was dead, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still, as if mourning the loss of an innocent life snuffed out too soon. But the moment passed, and the machinery of the system began to churn again. The guards moved to unfasten the boy's body from the chair, their faces emotionless, their hands steady. They had done this before, they would do it again. But for those who had witnessed the execution, those who had seen the innocent boy's life extinguished, the weight of what had happened would never truly leave them. It would linger in the corners of their minds, a shadow that followed them, a whisper in the dark that asked a question none of them wanted to answer. Why had they let this happen? The mother's sobs echoed in the chamber long after the doors had closed. The room was deathly silent now, thick with the kind of tension that made it hard to breathe. The electric hum of the chair, though barely audible, seemed to pulse through the chamber like a living entity. It was waiting. The moment was close, and everyone in the room felt it. No one spoke, no one dared to. They didn't have to. The weight of what was about to happen filled the space, heavy as lead, pressing down on every heart, every breath. Isaac sat strapped to the chair, his small frame swallowed by the cold, metal restraints. His head hung low, the soft hum of the electric current surrounding him like a cage he couldn't escape from. His chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths, the only sign that life still clung to him. His fingers twitched, flexing weakly against the thick leather cuffs that bound him. He hadn't moved much since they brought him in, just sat there, quiet, hollow. The guards shifted uneasily in their places, the gravity of the moment weighing on them too, though they would never admit it aloud. Even the executioner, a man accustomed to the dark work of ending lives, seemed to hesitate, his hand hovering just above the switch. His face was obscured by shadows, but you could feel the unease in the way he stood, too still, too stiff. As if he too was waiting for something, anything, to stop what was about to happen. The only sound, aside from Isaac's shallow breathing and the faint buzz of the electric chair, was the ticking of the clock mounted high on the wall. Each tick reverberated through the chamber, slicing through the silence like a metronome counting down to something dreadful. The second hand swept around in perfect rhythm, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding beneath it. Time marched on, as it always did, uncaring, unsympathetic. Isaac's mother, still pressed against the glass behind the viewing window, had fallen into a stunned silence. Her voice, hoarse from hours of pleading and screaming, was gone now, replaced by a vacant, hollow stare. Her hands, once clawing at the glass, now hung limply at her sides, her fingers trembling as if the last of her strength had finally left her. She was beyond words, beyond tears. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. The boy was going to die. Isaac knew it too. Though he was too young to fully grasp the horror of death, he understood enough to know that this was the end. His small, fragile heart beat wildly in his chest, faster and faster, as if trying to outrun what was coming. He had never felt such fear, not even in the courtroom when they had read his sentence. Not even when they had dragged him, kicking and screaming, into this chamber. This was different. This was final. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him, watching, waiting, the cold, detached gaze of the guards, the pitiful stares of those watching through the glass. It all pressed in on him, making it hard to breathe. His throat felt tight, his mouth dry, as if the very air in the room was thick with anticipation, waiting for the moment when the switch would be pulled and the end would come. That a single drop of sweat rolled down the side of Isaac's face, its slow descent a sharp contrast to the rapid, frantic beating of his heart. He could hear it, his heartbeat, pounding in his ears like a drum. Thump, thump, thump. The sound grew louder, more frantic, drowning out everything else. It was all he could hear, all he could focus on, as the seconds dragged on, stretching into what felt like an eternity. But even in these final moments, a small part of Isaac held on to hope. A fragile, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would stop this. That someone would step forward and say it was all a mistake, that they couldn't do this to a child. That someone somewhere would speak up for him, for the boy who had been abandoned by everyone. The door at the far end of the chamber creaked open, and for a fleeting second, Isaac's heart leapt in his chest. His eyes fluttered open, heavy with exhaustion, but filled with the faintest glimmer of hope. Perhaps it was someone coming to stop this, someone who had realized the truth, who knew he didn't belong here. But it wasn't that a man in a dark suit stepped into the room, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his face a mask of indifference. He carried with him a clipboard, the final paperwork needed before the execution could proceed. His presence was a formality, nothing more. He wasn't here to save Isaac. He wasn't here to stop anything. He was here to make sure everything went according to plan. The executioner glanced over at the man in the suit, waiting for the signal. A single nod was all it would take to end the life of the boy in the chair. A single, simple nod to Isaac's hope flickered, then died as quickly as it had come. And one was coming. He was alone. His small body shivered in the cold, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He wanted to scream, to cry, to beg for his life, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was too tight, his mind too numb. He couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. All he could do was sit there, waiting as the seconds ticked away, each one bringing him closer to the end. And then, in the midst of the deafening silence, a voice spoke. That it was quiet at first, barely more than a whisper, but it carried through the room like a gust of wind, unexpected and chilling. It came from Isaac, though his lips barely moved, and the sound was strange, like it didn't belong to him at all. His eyes, which had been glazed over in defeat, suddenly blinked to life, wide and wild, as if something had woken deep inside him. "They don't know," Isaac whispered, his voice trembling but clear. "They don't know what he did." The room seemed to freeze. For a moment, no one reacted. The words hung in the air, heavy, electric, as if they carried a charge of their own. The guards exchanged confused glances, unsure if they had really heard what they thought they had heard. Even the man in the suit paused, his pen hovering over the clipboard as he frowned down at the boy in the chair. The executioner's hand, which had been hovering over the switch, stilled. Isaac's chest rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal searching for a way out. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was shaking now, not from fear, but from something else, something raw, something desperate. The man who said I did it," Isaac continued, his voice growing louder, more frantic. He lied. He lied to all of you." Isaac's words hit the room like a bombshell, and suddenly, the air was charged with something new. Suspicion. Doubt. The guards shifted uncomfortably, their hands gripping their batons a little tighter, their eyes flickering to the boy in the chair. The man in the suit, who had been so calm, so composed, suddenly looked uneasy. His brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. "What are you talking about?" One of the guards asked, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. Isaac's breath hitched in his throat. His heart was pounding so hard now that he thought it might explode, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The words were spilling out of him now, faster and faster, like a dam that had finally broken. "He's the one," Isaac gasped, his voice cracking with emotion. "The man who accused me. He's the one who did it. He killed that boy. I saw him. Enough!" The man in the suit barked, his voice booming through the chamber. But it was too late. The seed had been planted. The guards, who had stood so still, so firm, were now looking at each other with uncertainty. Doubt was creeping in, slow but undeniable, and it was spreading through the room like wildfire. One of them took a step back, his hand trembling as he loosened his grip on his baton. Another turned to the executioner, his eyes wide with confusion. "What if he's telling the truth?" One of the guards muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible, but loud enough for the others to hear. The executioner hesitated, his hand still hovering over the switch. His face, hidden in shadow, was unreadable, but the tension in his body was unmistakable. He wasn't sure. No one was sure anymore that Isaac's mother, who had been silent for so long, suddenly sprang to life. She pounded on the glass with renewed strength, her voice rising in a desperate, panicked wail. "Listen to him," she screamed, her voice cracking with anguish. "My baby is innocent. He's telling the truth. You can't do this." The man in the suit slammed his clipboard down on the table, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He turned to the executioner, his voice low and dangerous. "Do it." But the executioner didn't move. His hand, still poised over the switch, shook ever so slightly. His eyes, once cold and indifferent, flickered with uncertainty. The room was heavy with silence once more, but this time it was different. This time, the silence was alive with the weight of everything that had just been said. Isaac stared up at the man in the suit, his eyes wide and pleading, his body trembling with fear and desperation. "They'll kill me," Isaac whispered, his voice barely audible now, his strength fading fast. "They'll kill me for telling you." The executioner's hand faltered. The room, already thick with tension, seemed to vibrate with a new kind of energy, a dark, ominous charge that no one could ignore. The words had been spoken. The truth, or at least what could be the truth, had been uttered, and now it lingered in the air like a foul stench, too powerful to simply fade away. Isaac, the small boy strapped to the electric chair, had said something that no one expected. In the midst of his final breaths, with the electric hum of death surrounding him, he had pointed his trembling finger toward the man who had condemned him. And with that single motion, the fragile balance of this gruesome spectacle had shattered. Everyone in the room felt it. The guards, once so still, so assured in their duty, now shifted uneasily in their places. The executioner's hand, still hovering over the switch, trembled. The man in the suit, who represented the cold, detached machinery of justice, had frozen, his pen suspended in midair. And Isaac's mother, who had been screaming through the glass, was now silent, her wide eyes locked on her son, as if she could feel the change in the air as palpably as anyone. The millionaire, however, sat in the shadows. He had been watching the entire ordeal unfold from the back of the viewing chamber, his presence mostly unnoticed until now. Dressed in an impeccable black suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the room, he sat with an unsettling stillness. His eyes, cold and calculating, had been fixed on Isaac from the beginning, but now they flickered with something new. Anger? Fear? It was impossible to tell. Isaac, with his frail body shaking, his voice cracking under the weight of exhaustion and terror, pointed again. "Him," he croaked, his throat dry, his breath labored. "He did it. Not me. He killed that boy." For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. The accusation hung in the air like the final beat of a drum before the silence of a death sentence. Eyes turned toward the millionaire, this untouchable figure who had towered over the case like an unseen puppet master, and the air itself seemed to crackle with uncertainty. The millionaire, Mr. Alastair Davenport, had always been untouchable. He was the kind of man whose wealth didn't just buy luxury, it bought power, influence, fear. His name alone was enough to close doors and shut mouths. He owned properties, businesses, and most importantly, people. Everyone in this small town had known who he was for as long as they could remember. His wealth had built the hospital, funded the local government, and lined the pockets of those who needed it most. He was, in many ways, the lifeblood of this place. But he was also something far darker, an unseen force that bent the law to his will. The accusation didn't fit. It didn't make sense. How could a man of such status, such untouchable privilege, be guilty of murder? How could Isaac, a poor, defenseless child, stand here accusing him in such a dire moment? And yet, as Isaac's trembling finger stayed pointed in Davenport's direction, the possibility, improbable as it seemed, began to gnaw at the edges of everyone's minds. The guards glanced at one another, uncertain. They had all heard the stories about Mr. Davenport, about his wealth and his influence. They knew that even a whispered accusation against him could mean losing their jobs, or worse. But Isaac's words were not a whisper. They were a scream, a last desperate plea from a child with nothing left to lose. The judge, seated high on his bench, seemed to falter as well. His gavel, which had once banged down with authority, now rested limply in his hand, as if the weight of this new revelation had rendered him powerless. His eyes flickered to the millionaire, then back to Isaac, and for a fleeting moment, you could see it in his face, the doubt, the uncertainty. He had seen enough corruption in his time to know that justice was a fickle thing, swayed by those with money and power. And if what Isaac was saying was true, no one dared to speak. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, until finally, Mr. Davenport himself rose from his seat. The movement was slow, deliberate, and for the first time, all eyes were on him. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the cold, stone floor. Each step echoing through the room like the ticking of a clock. He stopped just behind the glass that separated him from Isaac and his mother. His eyes, icy, calculating, narrowed as they fixed on the boy. There was something unsettling in his gaze, something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. It was the look of a man who had never been questioned, never been defied, and certainly never been accused. Boy, Davenport's voice was smooth, like silk over steel. You don't know what you're saying. Isaac flinched, but his finger stayed raised, pointing unwaveringly at the man who stood before him. You're lying, Davenport continued, his voice calm, but laced with venom. You're trying to save yourself. I understand that. You're desperate. But accusing me? A man who has done nothing but help this town. Help people like you? The words were so carefully measured, so perfectly crafted, that they would have convinced anyone under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. A child was strapped to an electric chair, moments from death. And in the face of that, no amount of smooth talking could erase the doubt that had already begun to creep into the minds of those in the room. That Isaac's voice, hoarse and broken, fought its way through his cracked lips. I saw you with him. You said no one would know. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Davenport's calm facade flickered for the briefest of moments, a twitch in the corner of his mouth, a tightening around his eyes. But it was enough to set off alarm bells in the minds of those watching. His polished exterior was starting to crack, just a little, but it was there. The unshakable, immovable force that was Alastair Davenport was faltering. I'm not lying. Isaac choked, tears streaming down his face now. His voice wavered, but there was a desperate truth in it that no one could ignore. You were there. You killed him. The guards shifted uncomfortably, their hands flexing nervously around their batons. They were trained to deal with criminals, with lawbreakers and troublemakers, but this was something different. The man Isaac was accusing was no ordinary criminal. He was the wealthiest man in the county, a benefactor to the very system that now stood on the verge of condemning an innocent boy. For years, rumors had swirled around Davenport. Whispers of bribes, of backroom deals, of threats quietly carried out in the dead of night. But none of it had ever been proven. Davenport was too smart, too powerful, and those who dared to cross him usually found themselves ruined, or worse. But this public accusation, spoken aloud in a courtroom filled with witnesses, was something else entirely. Davenport's eyes narrowed further, and his voice dropped, low and menacing. "Do you understand what you're doing, boy? Do you understand who you're accusing?" Isaac didn't answer. He didn't have to. His eyes, wide and terrified, said everything. And then something unexpected happened. One of the guards, standing nearest to Davenport, took a step back. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it sent a ripple through the room. The others, sensing the shift, began to edge away as well. They weren't just distancing themselves physically. They were distancing themselves from the situation, from the man at the center of it. Davenport noticed it too. His icy composure slipped further, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes: panic. The judge, still seated behind his bench, cleared his throat, though the sound was weak, uncertain. "Mr. Davenport, if there is any truth to these accusations—" "There is no truth," Davenport snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the tension in the room like a knife. "This is a desperate boy's last-ditch attempt to save himself from the consequences of his actions. Nothing more." But the room had changed. Davenport's words no longer carried the same weight, no longer commanded the same fear and obedience. The accusation, spoken so clearly, so publicly, had shifted the balance of power. And now, for the first time in his life, Alastair Davenport felt something unfamiliar creeping into his veins. Feared. Isaac's mother, still sobbing quietly behind the glass, pressed her hands to the window. "Please," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Please believe him. My boy didn't kill anyone. He's telling the truth." Davenport's fists clenched at his sides. He was losing control of the room, and he knew it. The doubt, the suspicion, the fear, it was all swirling around him now, choking him, suffocating him. He had to stop this. "Now, I will not be slandered by the likes of this boy," Davenport growled, stepping forward. His presence loomed large over the chamber, casting a long, dark shadow over Isaac. "I am a respected man in this town, a man who has given everything to help people like you. And you dare—" "I saw you," Isaac screamed, his voice cracking with the force of it. "I saw you kill him. You said no one would ever believe me because I'm just a kid, but I saw it. I saw what you did." The room exploded into chaos. Voices shouted. Guards moved. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally broke free. And in the center of it all stood Isaac, strapped to the electric chair, his small body trembling with fear, with anger, with desperation. Davenport's face was a mask of rage now, his carefully crafted facade completely shattered. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice venomous. "You'll regret ever opening your mouth." But it was too late. The words had been spoken, the accusation made, and there was no turning back now. The air in the execution chamber was electric, not from the hum of the chair's deadly current, but from something far more palpable: doubt, fear, and the flickering spark of possibility. Isaac, a mere child with his frail body strapped to the cold, unfeeling chair, had dropped a bombshell. His words, ringing out in a voice strained from terror and exhaustion, had accused Alastair Davenport, the untouchable millionaire, of murder. In a heartbeat, the carefully controlled script of the day had fallen apart. And now, the room itself seemed to pulse with the aftermath of that revelation. The switch, the one that would end Isaac's life, remained untouched. The executioner's hand hovered over it like a grim specter. But now, instead of certainty, there was hesitation. The man's fingers twitched, his knuckles white with tension. But something in the room had shifted. A creeping doubt, an undeniable question that could no longer be ignored. Isaac's mother, behind the glass in the witness area, had stopped screaming. Her tear-streaked face, twisted in agony moments ago, was now frozen in shock. Hope, fragile and wild, danced behind her eyes. She pressed her hands against the glass, as if she could will the unfolding events to sway in her favor, her heart trapped in a brutal limbo between hope and despair. "Wait," someone finally yelled from the back of the chamber. It wasn't a powerful voice. It wasn't even a voice of authority, but it cut through the tension like a knife. The guards, who had been standing stiff and uncomfortable, unsure whether to proceed with the execution or not, turned toward the source of the voice. It was one of the junior court officers, his face pale and slick with sweat. He seemed to be trembling as much as Isaac. We have to stop," the officer stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We can't go through with this." No one responded immediately. The room, still suffocating under the weight of Isaac's accusation, remained frozen. Davenport, standing tall and imposing, with his cold eyes fixed on Isaac, sneered. He looked like a king surveying the aftermath of a rebellion, one that he was certain he could crush with a single command. "You're going to believe him?" Davenport's voice dripped with disdain. His gaze swept the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "You're going to believe the desperate lies of a boy trying to save his own skin?" For a moment, it seemed like his words might hold sway. After all, Alastair Davenport had always commanded respect, fear even. He had shaped the town with his wealth, his influence. The people in the room had always bent to his will, whether they realized it or not. But today, something was different. The doubt, once ignited, couldn't be snuffed out so easily that Isaac's fingers still pointed at Davenport. His arm trembled, his voice barely a whisper now, but he didn't waver. "He's the one. He killed that boy. He made me take the blame." His words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. For years, Davenport had maneuvered through life without consequence, always one step ahead of the law, always one phone call away from absolution. But now, with the boy's accusation echoing in the ears of everyone present, the walls of his unassailable fortress were starting to crack. One of the guards, his hand still resting uneasily on his baton, took a hesitant step forward. His eyes flicked toward the executioner, then back to the trembling boy. We can't go through with this. Not until we know more." Davenport's lips curled into a snarl. "You're making a mistake." But the guard didn't back down. His hand fell away from his weapon, and his voice, though uncertain, held a new kind of resolve. "We can't execute a child when there's a chance, any chance, that he might be telling the truth." The other guards exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to follow this man's lead or to side with the powerful figure glaring at them from across the room. But as the seconds ticked by one, their hands fell from their batons. The tension in their faces was clear. None of them wanted to be the one to throw the switch. Not anymore. Not with this new darkness clouding the situation. That Davenport's face darkened, his usual cool demeanor cracking under the strain. His eyes, filled with a barely concealed fury, locked onto the judge, who sat in a raised seat, presiding over this nightmare with a gavel in his hand that felt more symbolic than powerful now. "Judge Reynolds," Davenport growled, his voice thick with impatience. "Do something about this farce. Order the execution. Now!" The judge, who had watched the entire proceeding unfold with a mixture of disbelief and growing anxiety, hesitated. His hand gripped the gavel, but it didn't move. His eyes flicked between Davenport and Isaac, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a millstone. The boy's accusation had stirred something in him too, a deep-seated fear that they were on the brink of committing an irreversible mistake. "I cannot order the execution," Judge Reynolds finally said, his voice low and shaking. "Not until we investigate these claims." Davenport's face twisted in rage. "The boy is lying. You're going to throw away the justice we've fought for based on the lies of a criminal?" The judge raised his hand, cutting Davenport off. "This court will not proceed with an execution until we have examined the evidence fully." The decision, once made, sent a ripple through the room. Davenport's control was slipping, and he could feel it. He had always been a man who could buy his way out of trouble, smooth over any cracks in his carefully constructed facade. But now, the cracks were widening, and for the first time, the people around him were seeing through them. That a murmur swept through the gallery, the few witnesses present exchanging hushed, tense whispers. The boy, strapped to the chair, had come within a breath of death, but now, with the judge's ruling, there was a glimmer of hope. Faint and fragile, but there nonetheless. Davenport stepped forward, his eyes burning with fury. "You're all fools. This child is playing you for idiots. There is no truth to his words. This is nothing but a last-ditch effort to escape his punishment." The judge met Davenport's gaze with a steady resolve that seemed to surprise even himself. "Then we'll see, Mr. Davenport. We'll see if there's any truth to his words." The investigation, once ordered, unfolded at a dizzying pace. The court, under pressure from the public outcry that followed Isaac's halted execution, moved quickly to examine the evidence, or the lack thereof, behind the boy's conviction. Reporters flooded the streets, headlines screaming about the millionaire accused by the boy who had nearly died in the electric chair. The world's eyes were now on this small town, and there was no turning back. Behind the scenes, investigators began to dig into the case with renewed vigor. For years, Davenport had wielded his influence like a weapon, bending the system to his will. But now, with the eyes of the nation on him, those who had once feared him began to speak out that a janitor from the courthouse, previously dismissed as a nobody, came forward with a chilling account of a conversation he had overheard between Davenport and one of the town's more corrupt officials. They were talking about the case, he said, his voice trembling as he recounted the events. "I heard Davenport say he'd take care of it, and that the boy would never be believed." The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. It was one thing for Isaac to accuse Davenport, but now there was corroboration. A piece of the puzzle that hadn't fit before now snapping into place. As the investigation continued, more cracks in Davenport's story began to appear. The young boy who had been killed, the very crime Isaac had been condemned for, had been found near one of Davenport's properties. At the time, no one had questioned why Davenport had been so involved in the case, why he had been so adamant that Isaac was guilty. Now those questions were being asked, loudly. Isaac, still held in custody, but no longer facing immediate execution, watched the whirlwind of events unfold with a mix of confusion and fear. He was only a child, after all, and the full weight of what had happened to him hadn't quite sunk in. His mother, though, was a different story. Her desperation had turned to cautious hope, though it was tinged with a deep, unshakable fear that it could all still fall apart. The courtroom was packed on the day Davenport was brought in for questioning. Gone was the polished, untouchable aura he had once worn like armor. Now, he was simply a man under scrutiny, his carefully controlled world unraveling before him. He sat at the defense table, his face a mask of cold fury. But there was something else there too, something dark and dangerous lurking beneath the surface. He was cornered, and like any cornered animal, he was dangerous. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman who had taken over the case after the first prosecutor mysteriously resigned, stood tall before the court. She turned to Davenport, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Davenport," she began, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, "you have been accused of coercing a false confession from a child, of manipulating evidence, and of using your influence to cover up a murder. What do you have to say for yourself?" Davenport's eyes narrowed, his lips pulling into a thin line. "I say that this entire proceeding is a farce. I've done nothing but help this town, build it from the ground up. And now, because of the lies of a boy, you're all ready to tear me down." His words, once so powerful, so commanding, now rang hollow. The people in the room weren't swayed by his wealth or his status anymore. The prosecutor didn't back down. "Is that why," she said, stepping forward, "you paid off key witnesses in the case? Is that why the records show that a significant amount of money was transferred from your account to the account of the lead detective on this case, just days before Isaac was arrested?" Davenport's face darkened, but he didn't respond. The prosecutor continued, "Is that why the janitor overheard you threatening the lives of those who might stand in your way?" A murmur swept through the courtroom. The weight of the evidence was mounting, and Davenport, for all his power and influence, was running out of options. But then, just as it seemed like the tide had fully turned against him, Davenport leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous light. "You think you've got me," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You think you've won, but you don't know who you're dealing with." The prosecutor, unfazed, simply stared at him. "Eliatanus." Davenport's smile was thin and humorless. "You think you're going to convict me? Ruin me? You think this boy's lies are going to bring me down? You're all fools. Every single one of you." The courtroom fell silent, waiting for him to continue. But Davenport simply sat back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. It was a chilling reminder that even with all the evidence mounting against him, he still believed he could walk away unscathed. But this time, the system wasn't so easily bought. The judge, who had watched Davenport's slow unraveling with a grim expression, finally spoke. "Mr. Davenport," he said, his voice firm and steady, "you will be held accountable for your actions. This court will not allow you to manipulate justice any longer." The investigation dragged on for weeks, but in the end, the truth came out. Alastair Davenport had orchestrated the entire case, using his wealth and influence to frame Isaac for a crime he hadn't committed. The young boy who had died had been a tragic victim of Davenport's greed, his life taken in a violent rage when he threatened to expose one of Davenport's illegal schemes. Isaac was released, his name cleared, but the scars of what had nearly happened to him would never fully heal. He had come within moments of death, all because of one man's desire to protect his empire. S. Davenport was led away in handcuffs. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of emotion. Isaac's mother wept openly, clutching her son to her chest, while the townspeople who had once feared Davenport looked on in stunned silence. Justice, though long delayed, had finally been served.